Long before history was written down, human beings were leaving messages in stone. Not stories, not names, but structures so deliberate, so carefully placed, that centuries later, we're still trying to understand what they were meant to say. Across oceans and continents, entire societies invested enormous effort into building monuments that don't fully explain themselves. Some stand alone, far from any known settlement. Others were fortified, repeated, or abandoned in ways that suggest urgency or fear rather than celebration. Tonight, we're going to explore 8 of these places. Not the famous icons you've seen 1,000 times, but quieter sites that raise harder questions. Places where archaeology offers theories but not certainty. Before we begin, if you're drawn to this kind of slow, thoughtful exploration, where history meets unanswered mystery, consider subscribing. These stories deserve time, patience, and attention. Now let's begin our journey on a small island in the South Pacific. On a small island in the South Pacific, there stands a gateway made of coral limestone. 2 massive pillars, each weighing somewhere around 40 tons, supporting a lintel stone across the top. The locals call it Hamonga a Maui, the gateway of Maui, and for centuries, no one could agree on why it was built. This is Tonga, a kingdom spread across more than 170 islands, most of them uninhabited. The Trilithon sits on the main island of Tongatapu, in a clearing that doesn't seem particularly special at first glance. No temple ruins nearby, no obvious astronomical alignment, just this enormous stone structure, standing alone in the tropical heat, about 13 feet tall and 19 feet wide. The thing is, when you get up close, you start to notice details that don't add up. The surfaces of the stones show chisel marks, precise cuts. These weren't natural formations shaped by wind and water. Someone quarried these blocks, transported them, and lifted that lintel into place. And we're talking about the 13th century here, maybe earlier. The oral traditions aren't entirely clear on the date. According to Tongan legend, the structure was built by Tuitatui, the 11th Tui Tonga. That's essentially a sacred king. The stories say he erected it as a monument to his 2 sons, or possibly as a gateway to the royal compound. But here's the problem with that explanation. The compound, if there ever was one, is gone. There's no archaeological evidence of buildings, walls, or ceremonial platforms in the immediate area. Just the Trilithon, standing there, waiting. For a long time, that's all anyone had. Local legends and guesswork. Then in the 1967, King Taufa Ahau Tupu IV, who had a background in education and a deep interest in his nation's history, proposed something different. He suggested the Hamonga a Maui wasn't a gateway at all. It was a calendar, an astronomical observatory. The king noticed markings on the lintel stone, notches cut into the coral at specific points. When he measured the angles, he found that notches aligned with the position of the sun at the solstices. Summer solstice on one side, winter solstice on the other. If you stood in the right spot at dawn on June 21st, the sun would rise directly over one of those marks. 6 months later, same thing on the opposite side. It was an elegant theory, and it made sense. The ancient Polynesians were master navigators. They crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using the stars, the swells, the flight patterns of birds. Why wouldn't they build monuments to track the sun's movement? The alignment seemed too precise to be coincidence, but not everyone bought it. Some archaeologists pointed out that the notches could have been added later, maybe even in the 20th century. Coral limestone is soft, relatively easy to carve. Without carbon dating or some kind of verifiable archaeological context, there was no way to prove when those marks were made. And even if they were original, did that really mean the whole structure was built as a solar calendar? Or were the notches just decorative? Then there's the transportation problem. The nearest quarry for this type of coral limestone is several miles away. Moving 40-ton blocks across that distance, even on log rollers, would have required hundreds of people, coordinated effort, engineering knowledge, and yet there's no evidence of ramps, no tool caches, no remains of the infrastructure you'd expect from such a massive construction project. The stones are just there. Some researchers have suggested the Trilithon might have been a symbolic gateway to the afterlife, a threshold between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. Polynesian cosmology places enormous importance on such boundaries. But again, that's speculation. There are no carvings, no inscriptions, nothing to indicate religious significance beyond the sheer scale of the thing. What makes Haumonga a Maui so frustrating is how much we don't know. We can't even say for certain how old it is. Radiocarbon dating requires organic material, and there's none embedded in the stones. Oral histories place it somewhere in the 1200s, but oral histories also say it was built by a demigod named Maui, who lifted the stones into place with supernatural strength. So where does the myth end and the history begin? Stand in front of this structure on a quiet afternoon, and you can feel the weight of those questions. 2 pillars, 1 lintel, and a silence that stretches back 800 years. Was it a calendar, a gate, a monument to royal power? We still don't know. In the high desert of north-central Mexico, about 30 miles south of the city of Zacatecas, there's a ruin that doesn't fit the pattern. It's called La Quemada, the burned place. And when you see it for the first time, rising out of the scrubland on a hilltop, you understand why it has that name. The stones are blackened, scorched, like something terrible happened here. The site covers roughly 15 acres, terraced into the slope of a volcanic hill. Massive stone walls, some of them nearly 20 feet thick. Pyramids, platforms, a network of causeways connecting different sections of the complex. And at the highest point, a fortified citadel with commanding views of the valley below. This wasn't a village. It was a fortress city, built to defend against something. The question is, what? La Quemada was occupied sometime between 500 and 900 AD, though the exact dates are still debated. That puts it roughly in the same period as Teotihuacan to the south and the early Maya cities to the east. But La Quemada doesn't look like either of those civilizations. The architecture is different, rougher, more utilitarian. The people who built this place weren't interested in decoration. They were interested in survival. Walk through the ruins today, and you'll see evidence of serious defensive planning. The walls aren't just tall, they're angled, designed to deflect attackers. There are narrow passageways that force people into single file, perfect for ambushes. Watchtowers positioned to see for miles in every direction. And the entire complex is laid out so that if one section fell, the defenders could retreat to higher ground and keep fighting. But defending against who? That's where the story gets murky. There are no written records from La Quemada, no glyphs, no codices, nothing. The people who lived here either didn't have a writing system, or if they did, none of it survived. So everything we know comes from the stones themselves and the artifacts left behind. And some of those artifacts are disturbing. Archaeologists have found evidence of human sacrifice, not on the scale of the Aztecs, who come centuries later, but enough to raise questions. There are tzompantli, skull racks, where the heads of enemies or captives were displayed. There are bones showing cut marks consistent with ritual dismemberment. And then there's the Hall of Columns, a massive structure at the heart of the site, where researchers found the remains of dozens of individuals, many of them children. The traditional interpretation was that La Quemada was a frontier outpost, a military stronghold protecting the more advanced civilizations to the south from northern barbarians. The nomadic tribes up north, the ones the later Aztecs would call Chichimecas, were known for raiding agricultural settlements. So maybe La Quemada was built as a buffer, a place to control trade routes and keep the raiders at bay. But newer research is challenging that idea. For one thing, La Quemada shows signs of significant population, maybe 2,000 people at its peak. That's not a garrison, that's a city. And the agricultural terraces surrounding the site suggest these people were growing their own food, not just defending someone else's territory. They were settled, organized, self-sufficient. Then there's the burning. The name La Quemada isn't just poetic. There's actual evidence of massive fires throughout the site, roof beams charred, adobe walls baked hard by intense heat, floors covered in ash. And here's the strange part. It all seems to have happened at once. Around 900 AD, the entire complex went up in flames, and after that, it was abandoned. No reoccupation, no rebuilding, just silence. Was it an attack? Did the northern raiders finally overwhelm the defenses, or was it something internal? A revolt, maybe? A religious purge? Some archaeologists have suggested the burning was intentional, a ritual destruction. The people of La Quemada deliberately torching their own city before walking away. But why would they do that? What could drive an entire population to destroy everything they'd built? There's another theory, quieter, less discussed in the academic literature. It suggests La Quemada wasn't defending against northern tribes at all. It was one of them. That the fortress was built by the so-called barbarians themselves, using techniques borrowed from the south, and that the human remains, the skull racks, the evidence of violence, weren't about defending civilization. They were about projecting power, fear. If that's true, then La Quemada becomes something darker, not a protective outpost, but a terror state, a place where power was maintained through brutality until one day it all came crashing down. The blackened stones don't say. They just sit there on that hilltop, holding their secrets close, watching the desert, waiting. Sardinia is an island that doesn't quite belong to anywhere. It sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, closer to North Africa than to Rome, speaking a language that isn't quite Italian, holding on to customs that predate the Roman Empire by more than 1,000 years. And scattered across this island are approximately 7,000 stone towers, massive beehive-shaped structures built without mortar. The locals call them Nuraghe, and no one can agree on what they were for. Nuraghe Losa is one of the largest. It sits in the west-central part of the island, near the town of Abasanta, rising out of farmland that's been cultivated for millennia. From a distance, it looks almost natural, like a small hill. But get closer and you see the precision. Blocks of basalt stacked in corbelled layers, each ring slightly smaller than the one below, creating that distinctive beehive shape. The central tower stands about 40 feet tall, and it's surrounded by a defensive wall with 3 smaller towers at the corners. The whole complex covers roughly half an acre. The dating is tricky, but most archaeologists place the construction of Nuraghe Losa somewhere around 1500 BC. That's Bronze Age. That's before the Greeks started building the Parthenon, before King Solomon's temple. These stones were already ancient when Rome was founded. Step inside the main tower and you're hit by the coolness. Even on the hottest summer day, the interior stays relatively comfortable. The walls are several feet thick, and there are no windows in the lower chambers. Light comes from narrow slits higher up and from the central shaft that runs through the middle of the structure. There's a tholos chamber, a circular room with a domed ceiling and a stone stairway built into the wall that spirals upward to the upper levels. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Each stone fitted so precisely that even after 3,500 years, the structure is still standing. But standing for what purpose? That's the question that's plagued researchers since the first serious archaeological work began in the 19th century. The most obvious answer is defense. The towers are fortified. They're positioned on high ground with clear sight lines. The entrances are small, easily defended. Many nuraghe, including Losa, have wells inside, which means they could withstand a siege. So clearly, someone was worried about attack. But if they're fortresses, why are there so many of them? 7,000 defensive towers on an island that's only about 140 miles long. That's one nuraghe for every 3 or 4 square miles. You could almost see from one to the next. That's not a defensive network. That's saturation. And it raises an uncomfortable question. Who were they defending against? Each other. Some researchers think the nuraghe weren't military at all. They suggest these were religious structures, temples, the circular chambers, the precise astronomical alignments that some towers seem to have. The artifacts found inside, votive offerings, small bronze figurines, suggest ritual use. Maybe the Nuragic people worshipped their ancestors in these towers. Maybe the height was symbolic, bringing them closer to the gods. Others argue they were status symbols, Bronze Age equivalents of castles, each local chieftain building his own nuraghe to demonstrate wealth and power. The more elaborate the tower, the more important the family. That would explain the variation in size and complexity. Some nuraghe are simple, single towers. Others, like Losa, are sprawling complexes with multiple structures and defensive walls. Then there's the practical theory. Maybe they were just homes, fortified dwellings for extended families or small communities. The interior chambers would have provided shelter. The upper levels could have been used for storage or as lookout points. The thick walls would have kept the inhabitants cool in summer and warm in winter. It's not glamorous, but it makes sense. The problem is, none of these theories fully explains the evidence. There are nuraghe with clear defensive features that show no signs of battle damage. There are towers positioned in places with no strategic value whatsoever. There are structures with astronomical alignments that also have wells and storage rooms. It's like the Nuragic people built these things for multiple purposes. or their purposes changed over the centuries of use. And then there's the question of the collapse. The Nuraghic civilization thrived for roughly 1,000 years, from about 1800 BC to 800 BC. During that time, they developed metalworking, built ships, traded with the Mycenaeans and the Phoenicians, created a distinct artistic style. And then, around the time the Phoenicians started establishing colonies on Sardinia, the Nuraghe stopped being built. The civilization didn't disappear exactly, but it transformed. The towers fell into disuse. Some were repurposed. Others were simply abandoned. Why? Did the Phoenicians conquer them, assimilate them, or did the Nuraghic people themselves decide these towers were no longer necessary? There's evidence of cultural blending. Phoenician pottery mixed with Nuraghic bronze work. But there's no clear record of conflict, no mass graves, no destruction layers. Nuraghe Losa sits there in its field, surrounded by olive trees and grazing sheep, and it doesn't offer answers. You can climb the ancient stairs. You can stand in the Tholos chamber where people stood 3,000 years ago. You can run your hand along the basalt blocks and feel the tool marks from Bronze Age chisels. But you can't know why they built it. Not really. The stones remember, but they're not talking. Cyprus sits at a crossroads, where Europe meets Asia, meets Africa, where trade routes converge and civilizations have clashed for thousands of years. But long before the Phoenicians, before the Greeks, before any of the empires we read about in school, there was a village on the southern slopes of the island, a settlement of round stone houses built by people who barely understood agriculture. They called it Khirokitia, or at least that's what we call it now. We don't know what they called it. They left no writing, no symbols we can interpret, just stones and bones and questions. The site was discovered in 1934, but serious excavation didn't begin until after World War II. What they found was staggering. A village dating back to 7,000 BC. That's 9,000 years ago. Neolithic, pre-pottery Neolithic actually, which means these people were still making vessels out of stone because they hadn't figured out ceramics yet. They were at the very beginning of settled life, and they were already building architecture that would last millennia. The houses at Khirokitia are unlike anything else from that period. They're circular, anywhere from 6 to 30 feet in diameter, made from limestone and mud brick. The walls are thick, built to last. The floors are plastered. And here's the unusual part. Many of these houses have interior platforms, raised sections along the walls where people would have slept or worked. Some of the larger structures have 2 levels, connected by stone staircases. These weren't crude huts. These were engineered dwellings. But the layout of the village is what really catches your attention. The houses aren't scattered randomly. They're arranged along a main street that runs up the hillside, with smaller alleyways branching off. There's planning here, organization. The entire settlement is surrounded by a massive defensive wall, in places nearly 10 feet thick. So these people, these early farmers who were just figuring out how to domesticate plants, already understood the need for fortification. Against what, though? That's the mystery. There's no evidence of warfare at Khirokitia, no mass graves filled with bodies showing signs of violence, no weapons beyond basic hunting tools. The wall is there, impressive and undeniable, but nothing suggests it was ever put to the test. Maybe the threat was psychological. Maybe just having the wall was enough to deter whoever they were afraid of. Or maybe they weren't afraid of people at all. Cyprus has wild animals, boar, deer. In ancient times, there may have been other predators. The wall could have been about keeping wildlife out, not enemies. Walk through the reconstructed houses today, and you get a sense of how these people lived. Small hearths in the center of each dwelling, stone tools for grinding grain, obsidian blades imported from Anatolia, which tells us they were trading across the sea. And then there are the burials. This is where Khirokitia gets genuinely strange. The dead were buried under the floors of the houses, right beneath where the living walked and slept. Adults, children, sometimes multiple individuals in a single grave. The bodies were placed in a fetal position, tightly flexed and often covered with ochre. Some had stones placed on their chests or heads, heavy stones, as if to keep them down. Now, ancestor worship isn't unusual in Neolithic cultures. Many societies honored their dead by keeping them close. But at Khirokitia, there's something more deliberate about it. The placement of those stones suggests more than reverence. It suggests fear, like maybe they believed the dead could come back if not properly restrained. There's also evidence of skull removal. In some graves, the skulls are missing, carefully removed post-mortem, probably after the flesh had decomposed. Were they kept as relics? Worshipped? Destroyed? We don't know. The skulls are gone, taken somewhere else, or perhaps ground down and scattered. The practice appears in other Neolithic sites across the Near East, but each culture seems to have had its own reasons. The population at Khirokitia probably never exceeded a few hundred people, maybe 300 at its peak. They grew wheat and barley. They raised pigs and goats. They made beads from carnelian, which means they had contact with the mainland because carnelian doesn't occur naturally on Cyprus. They lived in this village for about 1,000 years, maintaining the same architectural style, the same burial practices, the same daily rhythms. And then, around 6,000 BC, they left. The entire site was abandoned, not burned, not destroyed, just vacated. There's a gap in the archaeological record after that. For roughly 1,500 years, there's almost no evidence of human habitation on Cyprus. It's as if the island emptied out. What happened? Climate change is one theory. Maybe a drought made farming impossible. But you'd expect to see evidence of desperation, thinner livestock bones, changes in diet. There's none of that. Disease is another possibility. A plague that wiped out most of the population and scared off the survivors. But again, no mass graves, no sudden die-off visible in the burial record. Some archaeologists think it was cultural, that the people of Khirokitia simply decided to move on. Return to the mainland, maybe. Rejoin the larger Neolithic communities in Anatolia or the Levant. But that doesn't explain the gap. If people left Cyprus, why didn't others immediately take their place? An island with arable land and fresh water doesn't stay empty by accident. Khirokitia sits on that hillside, partially reconstructed, and it doesn't give up its secrets easily. The round houses stand where they've always stood. The defensive wall still marks the perimeter. But the people who built them? They're ghosts. On the western edge of Ireland, on an island so windswept and barren it feels like the end of the world, there's a stone fort perched on a cliff, 300 feet of sheer rock face dropping straight down into the Atlantic. The fort is called Dún Aengus in Irish, Dún Aengus in English, and it's one of the most dramatic archaeological sites in Europe. Also, one of the most baffling. The island is Inishmore, the largest of the Aran Islands. Rocky, treeless. The soil is so thin you can see limestone underneath. For centuries, the people here built walls from the endless supply of stones, creating a patchwork of tiny fields barely big enough to grow potatoes. It's a hard place to live, always has been, which makes you wonder why anyone would invest the massive labor required to build a fortress here. Dún Aengus isn't small. The outer wall encloses nearly 30 acres. There are 4 concentric rings of defensive walls, each one progressively smaller as you move toward the center. The innermost enclosure sits right at the cliff edge, a semicircular wall of dry stone construction. No mortar, just precisely fitted limestone blocks. Some of those blocks weigh several tons. The wall itself is 18 feet thick in places and originally stood about 20 feet high. But here's what makes Dún Aengus truly strange. Between the middle and outer walls, there's a band of stone pillars, thousands of them, jagged limestone stakes driven into the ground at angles, creating a field of obstacles that would be nearly impossible to cross. The Irish call them chevaux de frise, borrowing the French military term. They're designed to stop a charging enemy, break up cavalry, slow down infantry, make any assault a nightmare. Except there were no horses on Inishmore in the Bronze Age, and the fort is on a cliff. You can't attack from the ocean side. So who were they defending against that required this level of fortification? The dating of Dún Aengus has been controversial. For a long time, people assumed it was Iron Age, maybe 500 BC or so. But radiocarbon dating of materials from the site pushes the construction back further. Parts of the fort may date to 1100 BC or earlier. That's late Bronze Age. That's when the Mycenaean civilization in Greece was collapsing, when the sea peoples were terrorizing the Mediterranean, when the whole Bronze Age world was falling apart. Was Ireland affected by that collapse? We don't have written records from the period, so it's hard to say, but there's archaeological evidence of stress. Hill forts appearing across Ireland and Britain, weapon hoards buried in bogs, signs that people were nervous, preparing for something. Maybe Dún Aengus was part of that preparation, a refuge for the people of Inishmore when raiders came, and raiders did come to Ireland. We know that from scattered references in later texts and from the physical evidence of burned settlements along the coast. Vikings mostly, but they came much later. In the Bronze Age, the threats would have been different. Rival tribes, pirates, groups displaced by warfare or famine elsewhere, looking for new territory. Stand inside the innermost enclosure today, and you can feel the exposure. The wind comes off the Atlantic with nothing to stop it. On stormy days, the spray from the waves below reaches the top of the cliff. There's no shelter, no buildings remain, though there are the outlines of stone huts visible in the grass. These would have been simple structures, thatched roofs probably, earth floors, just enough to keep the rain off. The view is extraordinary. On a clear day, you can see the cliffs of Moher to the south, the mountains of Connemara to the north. Anyone approaching the island would be visible for miles. That's the point of building on high ground. Early warning, time to prepare. But the cliff bothers some archaeologists. Why build right at the edge? The defensive walls would have been just as effective 100 yards inland, and you wouldn't risk erosion undermining your foundations. Because erosion is happening. The cliff is retreating, slowly but measurably. Parts of the fort that existed 1,000 years ago are gone now, tumbled into the sea. Eventually, the whole thing will collapse. Unless the cliff was the point. Maybe Dún Aengus wasn't just defensive. Maybe it was ceremonial. The edge between land and sea, life and death. The Celts, who came later and inherited many of these ancient sites, considered liminal spaces sacred, thresholds, boundaries, the shore at dawn, the forest at dusk, the cliff where earth meets ocean. There's evidence of ritual activity at Dún Aengus. Not much, but enough to make you think. A deliberately placed stone with cup marks, fragments of pottery that suggest feasting. Nothing conclusive, but suggestive. Maybe the fort served multiple purposes. Defense when needed, ceremony when not. Local legends say the fort was built by the Firbolg, a mythical race who inhabited Ireland before the Celts arrived. The stories describe them as refugees from Greece, fleeing slavery, settling on these barren islands because no one else wanted them. It's mythology, not history. But like most myths, it might contain a grain of truth. Maybe the people who built Dún Aengus were outsiders, displaced, building on the edge of the world because they had nowhere else to go. The stones don't say, they just stand there, battered by wind and spray, slowly crumbling, holding that cliff, holding that view, holding secrets the Atlantic will eventually claim. In the arid hills of southeastern Spain, about 11 miles from the modern city of Almeria, there's a site that shouldn't exist, not in 3200 BC, not with that level of sophistication. It's called Los Millares, and when archaeologists first excavated it in the late 19th century, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. A fortified settlement with concentric walls, bastions, advanced metallurgy, and a necropolis containing dozens of elaborate tombs. This was Copper Age Europe. People were supposed to be living in simple farming villages, not building proto-cities with defensive architecture that wouldn't look out of place 1,000 years later. The site sits on a plateau between two rivers, the Andarax and the Rambla de Huechar, natural defensive position, steep slopes on 3 sides. But the people of Los Millares weren't satisfied with natural defenses. They built walls, multiple rings of them. The outer wall stretches nearly a mile around the perimeter, reinforced with at least 15 bastions, circular towers projecting from the wall at regular intervals. These aren't decorative. They're military engineering. Bastions allow defenders to create crossfire, covering every approach with overlapping fields of fire. Except these people didn't have bows that could shoot very far. They didn't have siege engines. So what kind of warfare were they preparing for that required this level of planning? The main settlement probably housed around 1,000 people at its peak, maybe 1,500. The houses were simple, circular stone foundations with mud brick walls and thatched roofs. There are remnants of streets, a basic layout, nothing extraordinary about the domestic architecture. But the fortifications tell a different story. Whoever designed these defenses understood tactics. They understood how to channel attackers into kill zones, how to create strong points that could hold even if the outer walls were breached. And it's not just the main settlement. Scattered across the hills surrounding Los Millares are at least 13 fortified outposts, smaller versions of the main fort, positioned on high ground, guarding the approaches. A defensive network. This is coordinated planning on a scale that shouldn't exist in Copper Age Iberia. But here's what really throws researchers. Los Millares was peaceful, or at least There's no evidence of warfare, no mass graves, no burned layers indicating the settlement was attacked and destroyed, no bodies with arrow wounds or crushed skulls. The fortifications are there, massive and undeniable, but they don't seem to have ever been used. So were they necessary, or were they symbolic? Some archaeologists argue that the walls were about prestige, not protection. That building elaborate fortifications was a way for the elite to demonstrate power and control labor. Look what we can make people build. Look how organized we are. The bastions and outposts weren't for defense, they were for display. Others aren't convinced. They point to the strategic positioning, the overlapping fields of fire, the careful integration of natural and artificial defenses. That's not for show. That's practical military architecture. Maybe Los Millares never came under sustained attack because the defenses worked. Because anyone considering a raid looked at those walls and decided to go somewhere easier. What's undisputed is the wealth. Los Millares was rich. The excavations have uncovered copper tools and weapons, including daggers and axe heads. The metallurgy is advanced for the period. They were smelting ore, casting metal, creating alloys. Copper sources exist in the nearby Sierra de Gardor, so they had access to raw materials. But more than that, they were trading. Ivory from North Africa, ostrich eggshells, amber from the Baltic. These people had connections across the Mediterranean and beyond. The necropolis sits just outside the walls. Over 80 collective tombs, called tholoi. These are circular stone chambers, covered by earthen mounds, some large enough to hold dozens of burials. The tombs have passageways, antechambers, sophisticated construction techniques, and the grave goods are remarkable. Carved stone idols, engraved pottery, personal ornaments, objects that suggest social hierarchy, specialized craftspeople, religious beliefs we can only guess at. One tomb in particular stands out, larger than the others, more elaborate. The passage is longer, the chamber more carefully constructed. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of over 100 individuals buried over centuries, along with ivory, copper, decorated ostrich eggs, ritual objects. This wasn't a tomb for commoners. This was where the elite, the rulers, the important families were laid to rest. So Los Millares had wealth, had organization, had contact with distant cultures. And yet, around 2200 BC, it was abandoned. The population declined gradually, then disappeared. The fortifications were left to crumble. The tombs were sealed and forgotten. Why? Climate change is the usual suspect. The region experienced a severe drought during that period. Rivers dried up, crops failed. Maybe Los Millares, with its 1,000+ inhabitants, simply couldn't sustain itself. The people dispersed, moving to areas with more reliable water sources. But that doesn't explain the fortifications. If the settlement declined due to environmental stress, you'd expect to see evidence of that stress in the final occupation layers. Desperate measures, changes in diet, signs of malnutrition. Instead, the abandonment seems almost orderly, like people made a decision to leave and carried through with it. There's another possibility, quieter, less discussed. Maybe Los Millares wasn't abandoned because of internal failure. Maybe it was because the world around it changed. The early Bronze Age was beginning. New technologies, new power structures, new trade routes. Maybe Los Millares, for all its wealth and sophistication, simply became irrelevant. The walls still stand, partially, eroded by 4,000 years of wind and rain. The bastions are crumbling. The outposts are barely visible, but the mystery remains intact. Deep in the Orăști Mountains of Romania, hidden among forests and steep ridges, there's a fortress that Rome couldn't ignore, Sarmizegetusa Regia, the capital of the Dacian kingdom, a mountain stronghold so formidable it took the full might of the Roman Empire 2 campaigns to bring it down. And even then, after the conquest, after the destruction, the Romans never fully understood what they'd found, because Sarmizegetusa wasn't just a military installation, it was something more, something that still doesn't quite make sense. The Dacians were a Thracian people who controlled much of what's now Romania and parts of Hungary. They spoke a language that's extinct now, left behind almost no written records. What we know about them comes mostly from their enemies, Greek historians, Roman generals, and the ruins themselves. Sarmizegetusa sits at about 4,000 feet elevation, accessible only by narrow mountain paths that wind through dense forest, natural defensive position. But the Dacians weren't content with geography alone. They built walls, massive rectangular blocks of limestone fitted together without mortar, using a technique called murus dacicus. The stones are cut with such precision that you can barely slip a knife blade between them. The walls are backed with timber and rubble, creating a composite structure that's both flexible and incredibly strong. Flexible enough to absorb the impact of battering rams, strong enough to withstand siege engines. The Romans found that out the hard way. Emperor Trajan invaded Dacia in 101 AD. 2 legions, auxiliary forces, the best military machine in the ancient world, and the Dacians held them off. The campaign ended in a negotiated peace, not a Roman victory. Trajan went home, built a monument celebrating his triumph. But the Dacians kept their capital. It took another invasion 5 years later with even more troops to finally break through. And when the Romans did, they found something unexpected. The fortress covered roughly 70 acres, but it wasn't all military. There were residential areas, workshops, storage facilities, and temples. Multiple sanctuaries built with the same precision as the defensive walls. One of them, the main temple, is circular, about 60 feet in diameter, made from massive blocks of andesite, a volcanic rock that's difficult to work. The floor is paved. The walls, what remains of them, show careful construction, precise angles, but it's the arrangement that catches your attention. The temple sits at the center of a complex of smaller sanctuaries and what appear to be astronomical observation points. Wooden pillars arranged in circular patterns, markers that may have tracked the sun's movement. The winter solstice, the equinoxes, the Dacians, according to classical sources, had a religious elite called the Tarabostes, priest nobles, men who combined spiritual authority with political power, and they were studying the sky. That's clear from the layout. But why? Religious reasons, certainly. Most ancient cultures tied their gods to celestial movements, but there may have been practical considerations too. Agriculture, determining when to plant, when to harvest. For a mountain people living at high elevation with a short growing season, getting the timing right would have been critical. The Romans destroyed it all. After the final siege in 106 AD, they systematically dismantled Sarmizegetusa Regia, knocked down the walls, burned the buildings. The temples were abandoned, deliberately desecrated. The population was killed or enslaved. Dacia became a Roman province, and the capital was moved to a new city in the lowlands, Sarmizegetusa Ulpia Traiana. The old mountain fortress was left to rot. But here's the strange part. Even in ruins, the site maintained a presence. Later inhabitants, probably Romanized Dacians, continued to visit the temples. There's evidence of ritual activity well into the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. People were still coming to this abandoned, partially destroyed site to perform ceremonies, to honor gods whose names we don't even know. What makes Sarmizegetusa Regia so frustrating is how little the Dacians left behind in terms of written records. We have a few words, proper names mostly, preserved in Greek and Latin texts. We have Trajan's column in Rome, with its spiral relief depicting the Dacian wars. But the column shows the war through Roman eyes, Roman propaganda. The Dacians appear as noble savages, brave but doomed. Their culture reduced to visual stereotypes. The archaeology tells a more complex story. The precision of the construction, the integration of religious and military functions, the astronomical knowledge. These weren't primitive mountain tribes. The Dacians had engineers, architects, a sophisticated understanding of both defensive warfare and celestial mechanics. And they had gold, lots of it. The mountains around Sarmizegetusa were rich in gold deposits, and the Dacians had been mining them for centuries. That's probably what attracted Roman attention in the first place. Not strategic concerns, not barbarian raids, just gold. After the conquest, Trajan hauled an estimated 500,000 pounds of gold and 1 million pounds of silver back to Rome, enough to fund building projects across the empire for decades. So maybe that's the real mystery of Sarmizegetusa. Not why it fell, but why it stood as long as it did. A mountain kingdom sitting on a fortune in precious metals, surrounded by empires that wanted those resources. The Dacians held out for centuries, built their temples, studied their stars, fortified their mountains, until Rome decided the cost of conquest was worth paying. Walk through the ruins today, and you can still see the precision. The cut stones, the temple foundations, the mountain mist drifts through what used to be sacred spaces. Eagles circle overhead. The forests have reclaimed most of it, but the stones remember, even if they're not telling. In West Africa, stretching across what is now Gambia and Senegal, there are stone circles, over 1,000 of them, spread across more than 12,000 square miles of savanna and woodland. They're called the Stone Circles of Senegambia, and they represent the largest concentration of stone circles anywhere in the world. More than Stonehenge, more than Avebury, more than any megalithic site in Europe. And yet most people have never heard of them. The circles vary in size. Some contain just 10 stones, others have 24 or more. The stones themselves are laterite, a type of iron-rich sedimentary rock common in tropical regions. They're shaped into rough cylinders, anywhere from 3 to 8 feet tall, weighing up to 10 tons each. Each circle is precisely laid out, the stones evenly spaced, creating nearly perfect geometric patterns. And there are so many of them, clusters scattered across the landscape, sometimes a dozen circles in a single location, other times just 1 or 2 standing alone in the bush. The most famous site is Wasu in central Gambia, 11 circles containing a total of 54 stones. The largest stone there is about 8 feet tall and weighs close to 10 tons. Stand in the center of one of these circles and you feel the weight of it. The deliberate arrangement. Someone put enormous effort into hauling these stones, shaping them, setting them upright. and they did it over and over again, 1,000 times. But here's what we know about who built them. Almost nothing. The archaeological evidence suggests the circles were constructed between the 3rd century BC and the 16th century AD. That's a huge span. Almost 2,000 years, which means this wasn't a single culture or a brief burst of activity. This was a tradition, generations upon generations, maintaining the practice of building stone circles. And we know their burial sites. Excavations have found human remains buried within and around the circles, sometimes individual burials, sometimes multiple individuals in a single grave. The bodies were usually laid in an east-west orientation. No cremation, no elaborate coffins, just bodies placed in the earth, sometimes with grave goods, iron tools, pottery, beads, nothing extravagant, but enough to suggest these weren't paupers' graves. But that's where the certainty ends. Because who was buried in these circles? Kings, priests, warriors? Or were they communal graves, reserved for entire families or clans? The physical evidence doesn't tell us. The skeletal remains haven't revealed any obvious patterns in age, sex, or social status. Some circles contain the bones of children, others only adults. There's no consistency. And then there's the question of why. Why circles? Why laterite? Why this specific arrangement of stones? Other African cultures built tombs, pyramids in Nubia and Egypt, rock-cut chambers in Ethiopia, earthen mounds across the Sahel. But these people chose circles, precise, carefully measured circles. Some researchers have suggested astronomical alignments, that certain circles mark the solstices or equinoxes. There are examples of stones positioned to catch the first light of dawn on specific days. But not all circles show this. Many seem to have no astronomical significance whatsoever. So if some circles were calendars and others weren't, what does that mean? Were different circles built for different purposes? Or did the purposes change over time? There's also the question of scale. Building even a single circle would have required significant labor, quarrying the laterite, shaping the stones with iron tools, transporting them to the site, digging the pits, raising the stones upright. You're talking about dozens of people working for weeks, and they did this 1,000 times across 2 countries over nearly 2 millennia. That suggests organization, centralized authority maybe, or a widely shared religious belief strong enough to motivate communities to invest enormous resources in these projects. But we have no written records from the cultures that built the circles, no oral traditions that clearly explain their purpose. The modern populations in Gambia and Senegal have their own interpretations, but these are largely speculative, passed down through generations that lost the original meaning centuries ago. What's particularly striking is that the tradition eventually stopped. The last circles were built sometime in the 16th century, around the time European contact with West Africa was increasing. The Portuguese arrived. The Atlantic slave trade began. Societies were disrupted. Power structures changed. And the stone circles, whatever they meant, were no longer built. But they weren't destroyed either. There's no evidence of deliberate vandalism, no Christian missionaries toppling pagan monuments. The circles were simply left standing, abandoned. Local populations didn't maintain them, but they didn't tear them down either. The stones just stood there, weathering slowly in the tropical climate, gradually being swallowed by vegetation. It wasn't until the 19th century that European explorers started documenting them. And it wasn't until the late 20th century that serious archaeological work began. UNESCO designated 4 of the major sites as World Heritage Sites in 2006. Finally, international recognition. But recognition doesn't equal understanding. The Stone Circles of Senegambia remain enigmatic. We can date them. We can measure them. We can excavate the graves and analyze the bones. But we can't know what they meant to the people who built them. We can't hear the ceremonies that must have accompanied the burials. We can't understand the cosmology that motivated such sustained effort over such a long period. The circles stand in the savannah, some leaning, some still perfectly upright. The laterite has darkened with age. The land around them is cultivated now. Millet fields, peanut crops. Life continues as it always has, but the stones watch, silent witnesses to something we've lost. We've traveled from the tropical islands of Tonga to the wind-battered cliffs of Ireland, from the Mediterranean coastlines to the mountains of Romania, from the Neolithic villages of Cyprus to the stone circles of West Africa. Different cultures, different time periods, different continents, and yet they all share something. They all present us with evidence that challenges our assumptions about the ancient world. These weren't primitive people stumbling through the darkness of prehistory. They were engineers, astronomers, architects. They moved stones weighing dozens of tons without machinery. They aligned structures with celestial events, using nothing but observation and patience. They built defenses against threats we can't identify. They honored their dead in ways we can't fully comprehend. And they did it all without leaving us an instruction manual. That's what makes these sites so compelling. We can measure them, date them, excavate them, but we can't know them. Not completely. The Ha'amonga and Maui Trilithon still holds its secrets about whether it tracked the sun or marked royal power. La Quemada's blackened stones won't say whether the burning was attack or ritual. The Nuraghe of Sardinia stands silent about whether they were fortresses or temples or something we haven't even considered. Khirokitia's buried dead, with their weighted stones and missing skulls, raise questions about beliefs we can only guess at. Dún Aengus perches on its cliff, defended by thousands of stone stakes against an enemy that may never have come. Los Millares shows us wealth and sophistication in a time when neither should have existed. Sarmizegetusa Regia proved that even Rome's legions could be held at bay by people the Romans called barbarians, and the stone circles of Senegambia stretch across the landscape, a tradition maintained for 2,000 years, then abandoned without explanation. These aren't the monuments that make it into the textbooks. They're not as famous as the pyramids or as iconic as Stonehenge, but in some ways, that makes them more important, because they remind us how much we don't know. How many civilizations rose and fell without leaving written records? How many achievements were forgotten? How many questions remain unanswered? Archaeology is detective work without all the evidence. We find fragments, pieces, clues that sometimes point in contradictory directions, and we do our best to assemble them into narratives that make sense. But the ancient world doesn't always cooperate. Sometimes the stones just stand there, silent, stubborn, keeping their secrets. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Maybe the not knowing is what keeps us looking, keeps us asking questions, keeps us humble about how much remains to be discovered. Because for every site we've explored tonight, there are dozens more, hundreds, scattered across every continent, hiding in forests, buried under cities, weathering away on mountaintops, waiting for someone to find them, to excavate them, to try to understand. The past isn't dead. It's not even past, as someone once said. It's right there, in the stones, in the foundations, in the walls and tombs and circles, speaking a language we're still learning to hear. Sleep well. And when you wake up, remember, the world is stranger than we think, older, more complex, full of mysteries that shouldn't exist. But they do. If you found yourself drawn into these mysteries, if you stayed with us through all 7 sites, do us a favor, hit that like button. Share this with someone who appreciates a good mystery. Someone who understands that history isn't just dates and names. It's questions, puzzles, stories that don't have endings yet. And maybe, just maybe, subscribe. Because there are more mysteries out there, more sites that defy explanation, more stories that need telling. The ancient world is waiting.